intro. Okay, I see. Yeah, thank you for a nice introduction. And today I'm going to talk about the structural abstraction and the behavior flexibility. And also, yeah, feel free to interrupt me anytime because I like to have a more interactive the session. So in every moment of our daily life, we continuously learn and build the model of the world to make a better decision. So, and the question is how the brain abstract everyday experiences into map-like representation and use this cognitive map to offer the behavior flexibility is very important to understand the human intelligence. So let's try to deep in there. Okay. So yeah, first, how do we make a decision? So thanks to our nice findings of the decision neuroscientists and the neuroeconomics, now we know how the brain computes and compare the expected value of the potential decision options for everyday life, such as what we want to eat for lunch. So this kind of decision is the previous study tried to describe this decision process in the brain using the reinforcement learning frameworks. So as you know that the reinforcement learning is provide a computational frameworks to explaining that how the brain learn to decide by getting feedbacks, and also explain how the large or small the prediction error, and that according to this prediction error, they deciding that how much they're going to learn or how much they're going to have a motivation to learn. And this this reinforcement learning so provide a computational framework to understand how we to learn from experiences. However, the standard reinforcement learning has a limit to explain how to make a decision that we never been made before. Because the RL, as I mentioned, is learn from the experiences. So how we making a decision when we don't have any previous experiences? For example, how can we making a decision like when we choosing like future lab mates, then how can we make a decision without the previous collaboration? But we know that we just to making those kind of the novel decisions successfully in everyday life. But actually, we know little about where the value come from in novel decision making. So how can we find the optimal? So we might can find this question through the we might can get some hints from this question from the previous studies about how we can find the optimal route without prior experiences. So in 1940s, Edward Tolman actually did a series of very interesting experiences, and I'll introduce one of his experiences today. So in this experiment, he trained the rat to navigate and find the goal in this route guided maze. And after the rat is training how to get the goal, and he changed this maze into this radial configuration. And after training, the rat might try to go to the previous route, but the previous route is not blocked. And Tolman find that very interestingly, the rat can actually find that the optimal route to directly to the goal, so as if it has a map. So, but as you think about it, it might be hard to explain it with the standard RL because no reward has been associated with the new route. So to explaining this behavior, Tolman coined the concept called the cognitive map. And this cognitive map explaining that when the rat is explored the initial environment, they might just having like some spatial layout and the relationship between the important locations, such as a starting point and the goal locations. And they can using this kind of the internal model of the world to find the flexible planning when the previous policy is not available anymore. So yeah, so this is also true in our everyday life. So we can just having the flexible behavior such as planning the novel routes when to achieve the goal according to the changing environment. So since the idea of the cognitive map is introduced, actually the psychologists and the cognitive neuroscientists also think about that we might using the same system to represent non-spatial relationship between the entities. And as you mentioned earlier, that the entity in here can be like an object and people, or even the state in the abstract task, or even events. So the powerful advantage of this having a knowledge structure, aka cognitive map, is that they allow you to generalize from the limited experiences to making a novel inferences. So for example, when you understand the structure of the family tree, you might can have also infer some novel relationships, such as when you know that the Mary's mother has a brother and who has a son named John. In that case, you know that Mary and John is a cousin. So likewise, that having abstract knowledge of this boarding process in the bottom, we can actually taking a flight in any new airport. So we don't need to learn from the very beginning that how to check in every airport. You can just apply the previous knowledge, and you can just making a boarding procedure okay in any new airport. So then, how does the brain build this cognitive map? So this ability of the brain to learn and represent the relational structure is extensively studied in the animal model, especially in the rodents, and also in the field of the spatial navigation. And these studies find that when the red animals is freely moving, freely traverse in the open spaces, there is some cells actually tuned into the representing the spatial relationship. So first they find the place cells in the hippocampus, which is like giving you the information about your current location. But also there is a grid cell in the entorhinal cortex, and this grid cell fires in the regular lattice, like you say in here, and which create the stable hexagonal firing patterns. And what we can have this grid-like pattern. So by tessellating the spaces, the grid cell provide a spatial metric such as a distance and also the angle of the navigation, so which can help us for planning the navigation. Interestingly, the recent computational model also shows that when allowing the AI agent to have a grid-like representation while they initially explore the environment, they can discover some unexplored routes. So which is suggesting the critical role of this grid-like representation for generalization in the spatial relationships. So I want to change the gear a little bit. So independent of the research in the spatial navigation, the wide range of the behavior flexibility also has been examined in the domains of the model-based decision making. And many of these studies actually study about the brain area called the orbital prefrontal cortex, OFC, and they're focusing about how this OFC is compute and learn the value from the hidden task structure. So in the previous study also shows that in both animal models and the patient study, in the with the recent patient study, they find that the people who have a region in the OFC have an intact memory about whatever they learn, like this one, they learn, but they cannot combine this learned information to creating the new transitive inferences. So it's suggesting that OFC might be very important to training the previous knowledges to making a structure, the model of the world. And in addition to that, the recent study also shows that the OFC is tracking the current state in the abstract task structure. And so it's actually very important in everyday decision making, such as that when you see the same observation, and some people might think about that we are in the different state, right? So some people might think about that we are still in the downing market, or maybe some people think about this is already bottom, so maybe it's going to be increasing now. So even though you have the same observation, but you have a different information about what is our current state, and which might make us to making a different decision, which make us to be flexibly adapt to the environment in the changing environments, changing situation. So I think that generalization and flexible decision making is a hallmark of the human decision making, human intelligence. And so it's generally we do this kind of the generalization and flexible decision making easily for everyday decision making, but it's still hard for the AI. For example, in the previous one of the previous study, interestingly shows that you might recognize this game like a brick breaker. And they showed that an AI agent can suppress the human performance in the playing video games, such as this game, after training, after have extensive training in this environment. But with any minor changes happen, after any minor changes happen, then they require to completely training to achieve the same performance. But in human, we can actually generalize our previous experiences in an environment with the minor changes. So this lack of the behavior flexibility also can be shown in many of the mental health disorders or substance use disorders. And I also want to make your attention, make your attention to the internal cortex. So because the internal cortex is interestingly is so to play an important role in the behavior flexibility is actually the earliest to degenerate the degenerated and the most damaged area in the Alzheimer's disease. So exploring how the brain learn and use the cognitive map can help to developing the potential application for early diagnosis, treatment, effect monitoring, and for the psychiatric patients, and also helping us can help the advance the AI that think like human. So this part it's important. This part is important. We have only limited understanding of the neuromechanisms and the computation of how we learn the structural relationship and have a map-like representation. So today,
Park,
sorry.
okay. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you
please.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if I understand correctly, can I understand the lack of behavioral flexibility for people with mental disorders as they have deficient or they may have incomplete hidden structures? Can I understand it like this way?
Can you repeat the last sentence? Can we what?
Yes. So in terms of, you say, for people who lack behavioral flexibilities, yes, especially, yes, can I understand the lack of flexibility as the kind of deficiency in the hidden structure? So they have different hidden structures as the normal people or people without mental disorders.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question. And I think that eventually we might want to moving this kind of research. But as you assume that the I'm not saying that this is the only reason causing this the defect in the flexible behavior, but it might be one of the causes, especially for some disease. For example, there's not really many studies going on. But I think that some interesting candidates might be some schizophrenia because that they have a problem to use their feedback to updating the hidden causes. So in that case, they might have the different map-like representation. We can assume that because the credit assignment part might be different from the normal people's. Or it's a little bit too early to say, but I read some interesting review that the autism spectrum disorder also, not everyone, but because there's a spectrum, there's some cognitive deficits sometimes, and actually they not only have some deficit in the social cognition, but also they have a problem to find flexibly navigating the world. Kind of stuff. So it might be related with actually the hippocampus, but I think there need to be more research need to be going on.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So today I'll be presenting my finding addressing the questions. And in the first study, we are going to study about what is architecture of the cognitive map of the non-spatial abstract relationship in the brain. And the second study, I'm going to talk about how does the brain use the cognitive map to make a flexible decision according to changing task goal. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how does the brain use the cognitive map to generalize previous experiences and to find a solution to novel problems. So first, I will talk about the architecture of the representation of the non-spatial relationship in the brain and how the brain used the representation of the cognitive map to make novel inferences. So when navigating physical spaces, the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex can learn and build the representation of the relationship between the locations. And this two-dimensional representation of the cognitive map enable us to find the unexplored shortcut. And how about the non-spatial relationships as like in the social hierarchy relationships? Does our brain use the same system to represent the social hierarchy structure? Sorry, while learning a relationship between the peoples? So if it's that, and how does the representation look like? And importantly, can we use this representation as a map and utilize the direct vector to find to make inferences of the unlearned social relationship as if we find the unexplored shortcut? So in this study, I'll try to address this question. So what geometry does our brain use to represent the social hierarchy? So there's a previous social psychologist also shows that people might having the multiple dimension to representing the social relationships. And they say that the social relationship can be represented in the abstract spaces where along the two dimensions of the competence and the wants. But unlike the space, but the important difference from the spatial relationship is in case of the social relationship, we only can learn the one dimension at a time from each social interactions. So what I mean by that, in the spatial relationship, you can updating the relationship between the two locations with like x and y axis in the equally. But in the social relationship, you might only can have a chance to updating a competence, but and also in another event that you can also updating the worms, but not at the same time. So considering that, the ideal representation should be able to accommodate the changes without affecting the other dimensions. So let's think about what can be some potential representation of the social relationships. So considering that, we think about the two hypothetical structure of the social hierarchy relationship representation. And the first one is a multiple 1D the representation. It means that the people might having the separate representation for competence and the warmth or popularity, and they're using one of them according to the need or the current context. Alternatively, you can also think about the two-dimensional representation in the Euclidean space. It means that these two dimensions are having the orthogonal representation. In that case, they're not interrupting each other, but you can still using the same representation to making a decision making. But interestingly, this when we making the inferences, when the inferences have to be made about the relationship, these two hypothetical structure would yield a different inference trajectory. So for example, when we try to make inferences about these two individuals in the competence and the popularity dimension, first, when we using if we're using the multiple one-dimensional representation, you can think about that the inference trajectory would be different. But when we having the inferences over this two-dimensional structure, then actually we can think about the inference trajectory would be the same, which means that they might just including the Euclidean distance between the peoples. So to test this idea, to test the architecture, what is the architecture of the social hierarchy representation, we conducted some complex experiment, and this experiment have the 3 days. We just conducted the 3 days the experiment with the human participants. And this study having the first 2 days of this study is a behavior training, and in the third day we also have some behavior training, but after that we have a fMRI scanning. During the behavior training, participants learn the relationship between these 16 peoples in the 2 dimension called the competence and popularity. And for each trial of the behavior training, participants saw the 2 faces, and in one of the 2 dimensions, so which is showing as a color. In here is the blue, it means that it might be the competence dimension. And also they get information that these 2 people have a 1 rank differences, but they don't know who is higher in the competence dimension. And the goal is to guess that who is higher, whose rank is higher in this dimension. And after they making a decision, we just give the feedback. And also having this feedback, they can confirm that who is higher in this dimension. And importantly, just participants learned 1 dimension in the first day, and they learned the other dimension of the same 16 people in the second days. And importantly, those participants never saw this the 2 dimension of 4x4 hierarchy during the whole experiment. So after this behavior training, on third day, participants were asked to make novel inferences in the fMRI. So in the fMRI study, we just show the 2 phases in the sequentially after showing the cue of the context, like in blue or red. And their goal is to find the higher the ranked individual in this dimension. And importantly, in the fMRI, the relationship between the 2 people can be more than 1 rank differences. So it means that some relationship is actually they never learned directly from the behavior training. And also there was no feedback to prevent the further learning. And also the one difference is that in the fMRI study, the context, so it means that the competence or popularity dimension is intermixed across the trials. And actually, I'm just to kind of minimize the explanation about this training procedure, but you might can also check about the more details of the procedure in the paper that I put it in the bottom. That is only explaining about our training procedures. And so we find that participants were able to achieve the very high level of the accuracies and of these novel inferences. And the question is how they can make these accurate novel inferences. So to test this, we have 2 different hypotheses. So let's think about if the participant making the inferences on the fly, they might just need to record a separate learned relationship. For example, if they want to infer the relationship between the 2 people, they might also, on the fly, they might need to think about that what is the people in the middle to link this one, because that is kind of episodic memory record, right? So it means that they're taking a longer time to navigating between the 2 people when the distance is further. Then we can think about that the reaction time will be longer when the Euclidean distance increasing. But if they're having a cognitive map already and they can actually draw the direct vector between the 2 people, in that case, that when the further the distance, which is the decision value is the more large, it means the decision is more easier. So they can making the faster decision. So in that case, we can expect that the reaction time would be faster when the Euclidean distance increasing. We're actually finding that the latter is true. So interesting finding is that we actually finding this effect of the 2-dimensional Euclidean distance even after we including the 1-dimensional rank, the task relevant dimension rank information in the same model to make them compete. So while we having these behavior evidences, we also tested if the brain have the same brain also including the 2-dimensional Euclidean distance when they're making inferences. So we find that this activity and the internal cortex and the BMPFC and the MOFC area, and this activity is well explained by the Euclidean distance over the other distance measures. And those studies suggesting that maybe the brain actually having the 2-dimensional representation to make these novel inferences. So to test this more directly, we perform the representation similarity analysis. So some of you might be familiar with this method, but maybe some people did not know this one. So I'll just briefly explaining how we did this. So we just for the region of the interest analysis, we just extracting the pattern of each participant, each people. We just extract the mean activity pattern associated with each people of the 16 people in the social hierarchy dimension, and we just compare their patterns. And by assuming that if they are closer in the social hierarchy, maybe the pattern would be more closer, more similar each other. But if they are further the distance, their pattern would be more dissimilar. So in this way, we're testing that if the representation having the two-dimensional Euclidean can be embedded in the two-dimensional Euclidean space. So we found that as the pairwise Euclidean distances increases, the activity pattern dissimilarity also linearly increases, suggesting that they might having this two-dimensional representation. This suggesting that when making inferences, participants not only representing the task-relevant information, but also task-irrelevant information when making inferences. So we're testing this one. So we find that not only the task-relevant rank, but also task-irrelevant rank is also represented when you're making inferences. And so we also testing this one in the searchlight analysis. It means that we're trying to finding where is the brain area having this the two-dimensional representation in the whole brain area. And we're finding that this representation is specific in the hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, and the orbital prefrontal cortex. And we find that it's kind of very interesting finding, because that as you think about it, the participant never asked to making the two-dimensional representation. Actually, they can have a correct answer, and they make a perfect inferences if they having the multiple, like a two separate one-dimensional representation. So our finding kind of suggests that the brain is spontaneously combining the relationship in the separately learned dimension, even when it's not required for the current task demand. So interim summary, so our finding shows that the brain used the same system for representing the spatial relationship to represent the non-spatial relationship that among the discrete entity in cases as a human, in the people in the social hierarchy. And the brain combined the dimension on the piecemeal on the separate days into unitary multidimensional representation in a two-dimensional space. And using the two-dimensional map, the entorhinal cortex and the orbital prefrontal cortex encode the Euclidean distance of the inference vector between the entity to offer the novel inferences. So this finding suggests that novel inferences depends on the ability to find a direct vector through the multidimensional abstract cognitive space. So I'm going to move into the second study, but do you have any question on the first study?
Yes, Professor
Oh, yeah,
Park.
please interrupt me. Yeah.
Yes, I'm a big fan of your research, and thanks for the organizers. I'm working on the grid cell and spectral navigation, so I got several questions related to some concept and detail in your experiment. So the first question is, the whole idea of this social space or social navigation is quite similar to the spectral navigation task. So in the spectral navigation task, we're asking participants to explore the environment. But I think in your paradigm, if I'm understanding correctly, this exploration phase is replaced by the learning phase of different relation among your person or collaborators. So I think the first question related to your paradigm is, I've found it's quite interesting that in, like, let's say A and B is same in the competence, but not same in the popularity. But in your paradigm, you do not directly, asking participants A or B is same in the competence. So why is that? I mean, I know your result showing that participants can organize all the people in a 4x4 map, but I think in your behavioral testing phase, you do not ask, do they know the relationship between the participants in the same level of same dimension? And second question is about, do you think this is it will work in the existing knowledge. I mean, the social hierarchy or social relationship, sometimes it's already known by us. So it's kind of semantic knowledge. Do you think your paradigm can be used to test whether or not our participants have the same structure as we want, if we designed a 4x4 map as you do about the semantic knowledge? So there is no learning phase, just testing phase. And do you think your paradigm can be used to measure this kind of structure?
Yes, so yeah, it's true that we did not asking the participant who did in this task, but actually we asking this kind of question to the participant for the later study that I'm going to show you later in the grid code. So actually we can go back that again. But I think that you point a very good, interesting point. So first question is about that how they know that they are independent and how they know that they cannot generalize in the 2D, right? That's what your question is about. So actually, this is a very interesting question. Actually, I'm going to talk about this one in my second study. I hope that that can be your answer. So if I did not answer your question that well, maybe you can answer again. I ask again after I show the second findings. And the second study is more deep. I don't know that there is a kind of special cases the human using the previous structure to learning the specifically for the social the relationships, but I cannot say. So I only can say the speculation. But I think there is a kind of the another studies and another group, and they kind of doing the same paradigm without the social stimulus. They actually using the abstract stimulus, but they just do the exactly same experiment with the mind. And as far as I know, they finding also the two-dimensional representation. So it might be not only the effect from the social, but I still believe that actually this kind of internal innate model is playing the role when you're starting to build the representation. And so this is actually one of the reasons that we actually using the social relationship, because the previous study shows that, as I say in the earlier pages, there's some evidence that the people might using the common spaces to representing the social relationship, especially they using this competence and the popularity dimensions. So that's why we just want to take a little risk before we don't know anything about this representation. So that's why actually we adopt this concept to testing this idea. So, but I don't know that if it's a different dimension, the representation can be changed or not. But actually, we are kind of testing a similar paradigm in the wine space now in the Iris lab. And we have some interesting findings, so it might come later. But only thing I can say for now might be actually it's not just to which domain you are learning, but also your learning experiences, like how you're learning and how to using this representation to making inferences actually can change in your representation. But that can be a little deeper question, so we might can discuss this one later. Thanks for the good question. Can I go to the next study then?
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so in the second study, so actually the first finding made me curious about how the cognitive control allow the brain to make a top-down selection of the information relevant to the current task goal from the multidimensional representation of the cognitive map. So what is a cognitive control? The cognitive control is a capacity of the brain to regulate the behavior to choosing the desire, the action, desire, the decisions. So as you know, the cognitive control has been studied mainly in most of the cognitive control study has been done in the perceptual decision making, such as Stroop task, as you see in here, or the random motion task. And in this task, participant asked to name the font color, for example, in here in Stroop task, and don't mention don't read the word. So in that case, the color is a task relevant dimension, and the word is a task irrelevant dimension. So, and for example, but when the color and the word is a congruent, which is uppercase, means that task relevant and task irrelevant are in agreement, then the decision would be easier. But when they're in the conflict, which is the bottom cases, then they're incongruent, and it making some conflict, so making you to have a more cognitive control to making a decision. And this study shows that the control demand is increasing when there's incongruences in attempt to reduce this interferences from the interference of the task irrelevant information. And also interestingly, in the neuronal representation, the previous study also shows that the context-dependent computation, which means that the top-down control making them to enhance the representation of the task-relevant information, while the compress or suppress the representation of the task-irrelevant information. So at the time of the decision making, so which helps facilitating the flexible codings of the decision value according to the task relevant features. So we think about that our social decision making task can be also understood as like the cognitive control task, because that we're asking them to who is higher rank in one of the each dimensions. So as you can think about that, if the two individuals have the congruent relationship, it means that their vector goes to this diagonal. In the case that the decision would be easier. But if they have to make inferences and making a different choices according to the which one is a task relevant dimension, then we can think about that this might be the incongruent trials. So our question is about that whether the same principles of the cognitive control can be also applied to this cognitive map. And why is important question? Because a lot of the previous studies have done in the perceptual decision making where the stimulus itself contains the value, right? So it means let's think about like a random motion task. So you can just observing this stimulus and you can having the evidence accumulated. It means that this value of the decision is actually depending on the stimulus. But in our cases, the value is not really in the face, the face visual stimulus itself. So it means that you only can sample the value from the innate internal structure of your memory. So you have to sample from the memory. So we don't know that whether the same principle can be also applied when you're making a decision, especially when the decision value is a sample from the memory. So to test this one, we have some hypothesis. So we just want to examine about how does the representational geometry interact with changing the task goal. And to answer this one, we have two hypotheses about that how they might interact. So I'm going to introduce this one, the two hypotheses. The first one is that we think about that the congruence influencing the representation of the geometry of the two-dimensional cognitive map. So the participant can, so what I mean by that the participant can share the same representation for learning and making inferences on the congruent relationships, but however, they need to build the two competing representation and choosing the current task relevant context, choosing the actions. So what does it mean is that to have unbiased two-dimensional representation, participants need to learn both congruent and incongruent relationship equally well. However, learning might be more easier in the congruent relationship than incongruent relationships. So what happens if the increasing cognitive demand due to the incongruences interfere with the participant's ability to build the representation? If it is that, then they would build the representation like they would have a warped representation. So I think also this kind of relate with your question about that why people have this warped representation, because they don't know that they need to build a two independent representation. It means that when you're trying to learn in the second dimension, you might try to generalize from the first dimension. If the people who have a more tendency to generalizing this two dimension, they might having this kind of the warped or the overlapped collapse dimension. But people who know that they cannot generalize in these two dimensions, they might having more orthogonal representation. And we also think about that according to your representation, we might can explain also individual differences in the cognitive control when they're making a decision. So we are going to test about this one. And the second hypothesis that we also think about that not only the task-independent two-dimensional representation, maybe brain also have a task-dependent representation. So it means that unlike the two-dimensional representation, the representation is dynamically, flexibly changing. It means that when you're in the competence dimension, which is blue, in that case, maybe you can just decrease the distance in the task-irrelevant representation, which is a popularity. It means that you're more collapsing or suppress the representation to enhance your ability to encode the task-relevant decision value. And so in that case, we can expecting that the representation is dynamically changing trial by trial according to which is a task-relevant dimension. So to test this one, we also conducted a parallel analysis with the fMRI, but also the RNN, the computation, recurrent neural network model. So we just training the same task to the neural network model to perform the same task with the human participant, and we analyzing the representation from the hidden layers. And we using the same RSA analysis to finding how the representation is evolved during the training. So why is a kind of useful method? Because that unlike the fMRI, we can actually track the changes in the representation in the course of the training. And also we can also relate the representation changes into their inference performance. So first finding is that while we just finding that the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex and the orbital prefrontal cortex have a two-dimensional task-independent representation, but we also finding this dynamically changing task-relevant, task-dependent representation in the parietal network, which also known as a top-down attention control or the decision-making network. We also finding the similar representation in the RNN. So in here, the x-axis representing the training step means that when you go to the right side, there is more training the network. And the y-axis is representing how much they having this two-dimensional task-independent representation, and also how much they having the one-dimensional task-dependent representation in the orthogonal ways. And first, we're finding that both representation is emerged in the neural network. We also finding interesting thing is that actually the brain learned the two-dimensional relationship earlier, but also and also there's going to be remaining even though you're having the extensive training. But also they're starting to be better to having the one-dimensional representation when there's more training. It means that they might just know that how to making this decision after they have a more extensive training. So in the next step, we're trying to analyze the warping. So how we're testing this warping. So first, dividing the two different vectors according to is it the congruent direction or the incongruent direction. And I just measuring the pattern similarity in the two set of the congruent and incongruent the vectors, and I just compare their I just compute the ratio between the two dissimilarity while I'm controlling the Euclidean distance. And that allow me to having the level of the warping. It means that where is the brain area having the more dissimilar representation in the congruent representation. And we just finding that in all subjects, the hippocampal activation having like this warped representation. And also we're finding the warping in the neural network, and we also finding this pattern of the warping. Interesting thing is that you remember that there's an increasing pattern of the two-dimensional representation in early phase, but this two-dimensional representation also have a very warped representation. So it means that when they're making inferences at the time, they're more likely correct only in the congruent dimension, but they're quite bad in the incongruent dimension. It means that their representation is like warped in this way. And eventually, when they're getting better, the inferences are going to be similar level. And actually, interestingly, you see that even though you're very good at the inference in the both congruent and incongruent the excision, we still can find a significant level of the warping. And next one, we're trying to find that we're trying to go to digging into the individual differences. But the problem in here is that we actually cannot observe that what is individual representation. So we're trying to infer the individual level of the representation from the reaction time. I know that the reaction time can be also different with many other different reasons, but our logic in here is that if the representation is what, then there's no reason that the reaction time is supposed to be biases. But if the reaction time is biases, there can be many reasons, but it can be also comes from the warped representation. So let me walk you through. So we are assuming that if the reaction time is also explained by the Euclidean distance, actually, regardless of the direction of the navigation, we can think about the reaction time would be similar. But if the representation is warped, you can see that the congruent distance vector in the congruent vector is going to be increases. It means that the reaction time would be faster. So it means that we can think about this is an example of the one subject, and we can think about how much you are more faster when it's a congruent the vector compared to incongruent vector. So we actually are making the distribution of the this like a speed, like how much your distance is influenced by the Euclidean distance, and we just distribute it according to the distance angles. And so if this one is a circle, then means that there's no biases. But if it's an ellipse, then we can think about that this is some warped representation could be happening. So with this measure, we're measuring the individual differences of in terms of the level of the warping. We just call this one the behavioral level of the warping, which is estimated from the behavior reaction time. And as you see that this is 27 subjects, and some subjects have a more greater warping, and some subject is less warping. And we're finding that where's the brain area. So to remember the previous slide, we're finding the hippocampus. It means that regardless of the individual level of the warping, where's the brain area where everybody is showing the warping. And now we're trying to finding then where is the brain area correlating with these individual differences of the level of the warping. And we're finding that with the amygdala and also medial prefrontal cortex having the subjective representation. We also performed the analysis to prove this one, but I think that we don't have the time to show this one, so you might can check about this one in the preprint. And so I also just last about this study, I want to also cover about that what caused this warping in the representation. So we can think about it actually when you're making an inferences from the congruent relationship, you don't need to think about what is our context because your action is going to be the same. But when you are in the incongruent relationship, you actually need to reinstate your current context to select the correct actions. So we think about that the level of the reinstatement, the context will be stronger in the incongruent when you're making incongruent relationships. So we're testing this hypothesis in the neural network first. So by making this context input is going to be noisier, we assuming that if the neural network is hard to reactivate the current context because we just including the input is noisier. In that case, they might have a hard time to reinstate this representation. It might causing also the greater warping. So that is true. We're finding the greater warping when they cannot available to access to the current context information. So we're testing this one in the same way. So we just compare the level of the context-specific activity patterns in the hippocampus and how much this activity pattern is reinstated at the time of the decision-making, especially in the incongruent trial compared to congruent trial. And we found that actually that the level of the reinstatement is also associated with their behavior level of the warping, which is a reaction time biases. So it's suggesting that the people who can use the context information well at the time of the decision making, they have a less warped, less biases in the decision making. So our study shows that the cognitive control for flexible top-down selection of the goal-relevant information from multidimensional cognitive map retrieved from the memory. And we just also, to answer this question, we are using the parallel analysis of the fMRI and the RNA network that was training to perform the same task. And we find the simultaneous two-dimensional and the one-dimensional task-dependent orthogonal representation supporting each of the representation supporting the representing stability and the flexibility respectively. And we also finding the individual differences because it's causing the cognitive control demand when you're learning the incongruences that might causing the individual differences in the subjective representation, and they might just causing this warping, and we're finding this is also represented in the brain. Yeah. And our findings suggesting that intricate bidirectional relationship between the cognitive control and the representation geometry in the cognitive map. So I know that I'm almost time's up, but I also want to talk about the grid study, which might be you guys are most interesting about it. Can I just continue to the grid study, or is it possible, or how do you think about it?
Yes, please.
Oh yeah, I'll just make it quick, and I can just have a question later maybe about that. Sorry about it. So as you know that so actually these two study that I'm showing is actually coming from the same data, that the warping and the two-dimensional representation, but this one is from the different subjects. So in this study, we try to think about that if this entorhinal cortex and hippocampus have a two-dimensional representation, can we using the grid-like representation to navigate the social spaces to making a novel inferences? So after finding the grid cells in the rodent entorhinal cortex, recent study also shows successfully the hexadirectional grid-like representation in the human with fMRI. So first study is about the 2010 from the Dolos group, and they just find the grid-like representation while they're navigating in the virtual spaces. And also true in the visual memory search, and also even the sound frequency dimension, like this study that the rat have to, it's not fMRI, but the rat just waiting special tone, and why the tone is frequency is changing. So we're finding that it's kind of rat is navigating through the sound space. And also this is also true in the human with odor intensity between the two odor mixtures ratio. And also you might know this study well about this conceptual space in the bird study. So it means that in this study that the participant need to find the specific location according to the neck and leg ratio of this bird stimulus while they are morphing. So they're finding that actually this the neck and neck ratio is actually represented in the two-dimensional space, and the grid-like representation is allowing them to navigate the space. But actually there is some question is still not addressed at the time. So it means that those studies actually are finding the grid-like representation in the experience trajectory. So my question is, can we finding the grid-like representation when we're trying to find the unexplored trajectory, like when we're finding the shortcut, unexplored shortcut? And also we want to testing this one, whether this grid-like representation can be also found in the discrete options between the trajectory between the discrete option, because this previous study, as you see that they are navigating continuous space while they are receiving the continuous sensory feedback. But in the discrete decision making, we don't have this kind of the sensory feedback in the continuous dimension. But I think this is a very important question because our knowledge is mainly organized in the network structure. So we try to answer this question. So to answer this question, I just making a novel task. So in this task, in the fMRI, participants saw this the phases, actually it's 3 phases, but in this way. So during each trial, we call this study as a partner selection task. And they see the 3 phases in the sequential order. So their goal is to try to find that which collaboration would be more beneficial to them. To make a correct answer, then to compute called the growth potential. We say the growth potential means that how much the benefit that each collaboration can expect. So to compute the growth potential, we just give some information that that you need to think about the higher rank between the 2 people in each of the 2 dimensions. We did not actually talk about that how you compute the this growth potential in the two-dimensional space, because in this study as well, the participant did not show this two-dimensional space. So we're just giving them to compute the growth potential based on the higher ranked people in each of the two dimension. But yeah, but actually that when you know this rule, actually, and if you have this two-dimensional representation, the growth potential is actually corresponding to the size of this rectangle drawn by the position of the two people in this 4x4 network. Yeah, for example, in this example, the F0, who is a middle level, who is a low level of the competence and the middle level of the popularity, might get the more benefit from the collaborating with the F1, who can compensate her weakness. But also importantly, we didn't training this task for the participant. The participant only training from the same way we done in the previous study. So it means that they learning this representation in the one study and asking them to using this representation to find a novel solution in find a solution in the novel study, novel task. So we just testing that whether the grid-like representation can be used to finding the novel vector, for the vector to find the novel solution in this task. So first, we're finding, before we go to the grid-like representation, sorry, we find the 2D representation in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. But also, we asking after everything is done, after every scanning and everything is done, we asking the participant to place where they think each people is located in the two-dimensional spaces. And as you see that, because this is a kind of subjected overtraining compared to the first study, we're finding that actually they're having the perfect the 4x4 representation. So this is a participant who dragging each faces in the screen and putting with the mouse and put them into the two-dimensional spaces. And we're finding that our all subjects can making a correct 4x4 the representation in terms of their reporting. Sorry. So I'll just briefly cover about how we just measuring the grid-like representation in the fMRI. So let's think about that. This is like a grid field in some people's entorhinal cortex. And you can think about that this representation is a tilt with the angle of the phi. And we can think about it when they're navigating like a zeta 1 and the zeta 2 vectors. Maybe when they go through the zeta 1 vectors, there's a more grid cell phi. They need to go through the more firing field, means that they have a greater activity compared to when they're navigating to the zeta 2 direction, which is that they only passing the one firing field. So we think about the when is aligned, when your vector is aligned to your grid angle, the activity is going to be stronger compared to when it's misaligned. Eventually, we will creating this six-fold modulation according to the distant angles. So if you have any question about the detail about how I did in the method, I have another slide can show, but yeah, just ask me about it. And so we're finding the hexadirectional grid-like representation in the brain. In the first, we're finding the entorhinal cortex and the MPFC, which is also the brain area. In the previous study, also finding the grid cells in the human single cell recordings. And also, interestingly, the other study also finding this area in their the grid-like representation, like the continental Nescus, the bird study. So we're finding that this activity is increasing when it's aligned and decreasing when it's misaligned, and showing this hexadirectional representation, hexagonal modulation. But interestingly, we also finding this hexadirectional representation also in the temporal parietal junction and the superior temporal circles, and this is known as the social decision-making area. So that made me curious about that. Is there kind of relationship between the grid-like representation and also task demand? In here is more like the social decision making, especially more like a perspective taking. What I mean by that is our task is inherently asking them to think about the other people's position and making a decision for them, right? Making a decision on behalf of them. So it's exactly like the theory of mind task in the social neuroscience. So we just want to test about it if the grid-like representation provide the input to the brain area to compute the social value, which is a growth potential value. And it might be they have some connection between them. So what we think about is that we just trying to test this one. First, we find where's the brain area, including the growth potential, trial by trial growth potential. So as you know, this is a typical theory of mind network in the MPFC and the TPJ. And we try to test that if the brain have a own grid, maybe their encoding of the growth potential also can be increases. But maybe if it's the misaligned it, maybe the encoding, the level of the encoding of the growth potential in the MPFC and the TPJ also decreasing. So it means that they're kind of fluctuated by getting the input from the grid representation. So actually, we find that this is true. So it means that while they are encoding the growth potential in the trial by trial, the level of the beta is greater when they're in the aligned compared to misaligned. So it's suggesting that the grid-like representation might provide like a compass. They're just providing the input about where is this people's relationship, and this one is critical to compute the growth potential value, which is a social decision-making value in this task. And the summary that our study showed the first evidence that the grid-like representations map the non-spatial relationship between the discrete options in the absence of continuous sensory feedback. And this effect was specific for the sixfold, and which is suggesting that the hexagonal, this corollary to hexagonal firing field of the grid cell. And we also show this, before that, I just want to mention that we also testing not only the 6, but also we were also testing the 4, 5, 7, 8-fold, and showing that this is specifically for the 6-fold representation. And we also show that this representation allowing to the integration of the multidimensional information to construct the value for the novel decision. So it's suggesting that the grid-like representation might allow him to generalize the previous learned structure, previous learned cognitive map, and transfer this knowledge to making a decision in the novel task. Yes, so I mean, yeah, I just want to maybe one last slide. So I just to show that when you're having this representation, we are not only able to find the shortcut in the physical spaces, but also you can making a flexible decision making according to your current need. So we are not just repeating the previous real options, right? We just can select our lunch option according to whether I care about the health or whether I care about the taste at the time. And also, it also also suggesting that it also allowing to find the novel solution, finding the solution in the novel task. And my study kind of shows that to offer this behavior flexibility, the OFC and the hippocampus is kind of interacting very closely together. But the two areas studied in the very different cognitive study domain, like a spatial reasoning and the model-based planning. So I think it's very important go next step as that how the reinforcement learning can integrate the neural representation of the model and how this representation is also influencing the computation in the reinforcement learning in the OFC area. It might be very important in the next step. Thank you for listening to my talk. Okay, also just I want to show that the co-authors, I just really honored to working with them, especially with Iri and also the Sharon, and also that Douglas helping me to collect a lot of the data, which is amazing. And also that the Miriam and the Jake and the Randy helped me to making the RNN models. And the RSS, I got help from the Hamed. And as you know that I'm now in the Lyon in France. So yeah, I just want to give an update. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Park. It's very substantial research and also very inspiring and intriguing.
Thanks.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I think we still have 3 or 4 minutes for 1 or 2 questions. Yeah. So the first question is from Hanbo in the chat box, and he asks you, does the study, I believe, should be the second study you mentioned is from Summerfield's lab.
Yeah, so Flash error, I think that's what you're talking about, is it? So yeah, so when we read that paper, we also that they also got the inspiration from the original study from the random motion task from the MindRL, which also they're analyzing in the same paper. So yeah, so we think about that. Yeah, it might be true that can be understood like the task-dependent representation might be. So if they're having a two-dimensional representation, they might using this one like this way according to your task dimension. So yeah, we try to test that whether the same representation can be founded, and we actually finding the map very similar like their map. But also importantly, I think that their studies actually still came from the more perceptual decision making. So even though they still need to be trained, but actually the stimulus came from like a two-dimension. I think it's like a Leibniz and something else. So yeah, so basically the three stimulus can be also representing where is their position, because the visual stimulus can also contain the representation. But in our task is purely came from the memory, so they have to sample from their memory. So we just want to test in this one.
Okay. Yeah, another question from the chat.
I'm just doing. Oh. Okay. Yeah, that is yeah, there's many things I want to do. Basically, so as I say that I used to work with the kind of reinforcement learning, the previous the study that I did not mention today, but also these days I'm working in the cognitive map. And as I say that why I'm interested about this cognitive map is actually that is kind of model when we talk about the model-based decision making, right? So the thing is that when we making the reinforcement learning model, and just when we study reinforcement learning, we just assuming that people have a representation, and we just using that this is maybe the places where you can get the value. But we don't know where the representation is, and we don't know exactly what is the geometry of this representation. Because if this representation geometry might be different across the people, or some people having more efficient representation, some people have a not very efficient representation. In that case, we might be explaining the individual differences in the reinforcement learning too, right? And so that will be, so I'm trying to understanding how your experiences, learning experiences shape the representation geometry, and also how this representation geometry can also give you the input when you're making the reinforcement learning. Like yeah, so that kind of interaction will be very interesting, and I want to go that direction. And there's many questions we actually need to answer if you think about it in this way. Yeah. Thanks for the great comment. How the incongruence warping from the second study affect. Oh yeah, oh my God, that's a very good question. So this question is about how the warping can influencing the grid-like representation. Oh my God, I don't know that I have a I can do this one or not, but okay.
Do you want to share your screen again?
Yes, so I'm going to sharing the different slide. That's why I'm just turn off. But okay.
Yeah.
So there is some studies actually study about these grid cells in the warp spaces. So it means this is a kind of the spatial navigation study, and they shows that actually when you are in the warped space, like little different warping, but in that case you also can see that this grid code can be warping. But this one means that the animals can think about that this one is actually the rectangular space, because they cannot actually see that in the bird wide view. So that's why, because you have a less uncertainty, it's kind of the assumption, but anyways, the long story short is that when you think about the not square space as a square space, then your grid-like representation can be warped. But the question is, it can be a little more complicated than that. So we can think about that, the different cases. So it means that you can think about it that they already know this is an unwarped space, if they know this is a 4x4 space, but how can I say? So what I mean is that it's depending on that whether you think about that this space is the square or this space is already warped. So if you think about this space is already warped, then maybe that your grid also can be, your grid's representation is also warped according to that. But if you just know that you're navigating the correct direction, even though you have the warped representation, then maybe it's also kind of different. It's a little bit difficult to explain with a short time, but basically we can think about it is a relationship between that, how you encode the spatial relationship, but also how do you encoding your navigation direction. So according to this combination, we can think about the different hypotheses. So I don't know the answer, but I think it can be potentially very interesting question. And I think that maybe one of the new studies in the Iris lab actually trying to finding this the grid-like representation in the subjective spaces in the value-based decision making. And the first us is Mark Olaf, and yeah, he potentially finding his finding is very interesting. So I hope that he can show some interesting results for related to this question.
Yeah. So all right, I think we are running out of time. And thank you again, Seongmin or Dr. Park, to joining our activity today. And I would like to suggest everyone to unmute and give Dr. Park a very warm round of applause. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. So would you mind if other people have any questions or want to know more details? Would you mind if they emailing you and ask you for clarification?
Please, yeah, I just to cover too much thing and there might be no much time to discuss about it. So I'm happy to get more emails. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much again, Dr. Park, and also I hope to see you in Lyon, in France, in the future.
Yeah. Also, maybe if somebody is going to the SFN this year, I'll be there. So maybe you can say hi to me too. Yeah.
Yeah. That'll be. I'm very much looking forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Park.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Then thanks everyone and have a nice day.
See
Bye.
you.
See you.